Spiral Dynamics. And I'm thinking I kind of want to jump into talking about some of the parables in the Bible. But this week, I really wanted to honor Memorial Day, and I wanted to talk about what it means, at least a little bit about what it means to me, and what it means in the context of the things that are going on today, right now. As some of you may know, Memorial Day was originally referred to as Decoration Day. And it was called that because people would literally go out, and some still do today, as you know in that previous slide, and actually decorate the graves of the veterans. It started, just following the Civil War, and finally became a federal holiday in 1971. And there's been a lot of discussion and kind of, oh no, we started it. But one of the earliest Memorial Day commemorations was organized really almost immediately after the end of the war by a group of freed slaves in Charleston, South Carolina. I don't think they're recognized as the people who started it, but it began that soon. That feeling of gratitude. One of the things that I found a little, ironic was that, for a long time, even though we were one nation, we had a divided Memorial Day. And actually, as some of us here in the South know, there are still Confederate Memorial Days here in the South. Now, the nation did come together after the First World War, and we tend to do one great big Memorial Day, but there's still a few folks that hang on and do their Confederate Memorial Day. There were a lot of pictures on Google that of Confederate Memorial Day that kind of bothered me. But this group of Confederate patriots with a cannon pointed at them made the field artillerist in me happy. So that's the one I'm sharing. So
I just don't get it.
yeah, I'm yeah, I know that we all want to have some feeling of okay. So I'll share a little bit since you said that. I guess in some ways I can feel for them. If we've had members of our family who have served, we want to think that they served honorably. We want to honor their sacrifice, and it's difficult to come to grips with them having done it in a cause that history shows us to be less than pure. I can't name anyone on the Perry side of my family that died in action. Somebody may have, back. It would have been before World War I. My grandfather Perry was on board the old Arizona during the First World War, but he didn't get killed. But on my mother's side of the family, my mom's maiden name was Custer, and a bunch of my family died at the Little Bighorn. And it's, for a long time, I really wanted to be proud of those guys. And recently, the more I've learned about them, and the more I have, as I've grown, and I've not just read the whitewashed version of, the history between the United States government and the Native Americans, but the more I've found out about, how racist George Armstrong Custer was, it's made it tough. on the one hand, his brother Tom, who died with him, was the first person to win the Medal of Honor twice. And on the other hand, they died in a genocidal war. It's complex. And I know that a lot of the Southern folks who have members of their family who passed, they probably have some of those similar mixed emotions. And yet I also have my feelings about the cause they died for. So it's one of those things where a little grace and it's not easy. But go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I can understand like the conflict that must go on in your heart if you've had like relatives or something like that, that have died for a cause that maybe today we look at and say that's a horrible thing to die for, but what I don't understand, I think really, is the people who just take it and try to pass it off as that, like some kind of like a pride, pride of heritage, when it's really like I'm from Winston County, and I don't know how much you know about Winston County, but we seceded from the South, from the Confederacy, not because we had a problem with what they were fighting for, but because we didn't want to fight at all. That like Winston County was a really poor county at the time, and that there weren't many slave owners. And so, I mean, like they seceded, but it wasn't necessarily for a noble reason,
Right.
And like now in Winston County, like in the past 5 years, there's been a Confederate monument put up, and this giant like Confederate flag that's probably the size of a minivan. and like it makes no sense to me, and it just upsets me every time I see it. Because there may have been some people that got drafted and ended up fighting and passed away that they have relatives, but at the same time, like this wasn't even, I don't know, I get so angry about it.
Yeah, it's funny how this is one of those things that can create mixed emotions, and it's not the only war that people had mixed feelings about. And it's funny. I grew up in West Virginia, which when Virginia seceded from the Union, West Virginia seceded from Virginia. But there were people on both sides in the counties that are now West Virginia. So and again, it was not necessarily that they were noble or anything. They were a bunch of poor people that didn't have many slaves, and had been kind of looking for a way to get out from under the people in Richmond for a long time. So that they saw their chance and they took it. But all that having been said, to honor those who have given their all, I was led to a verse that is found in the Gospel of John. Now, you guys don't hear me quote from John very often, because there are a lot of really much more educated and more learned biblical scholars than me, who have come to the conclusion that John doesn't actually contain a whole lot of things that they think Jesus actually said. That much of it is really a response of his, the Johannine community, which was somewhat later, at least a couple generations after he had gone. And if you read it, you'll see that John and Paul form a lot of what we tend to think of as a more evangelical Christianity. And it's really coming from what Bible scholars refer to as the cult of the Christ, whereas the synoptic gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, And then some of the non-canonical gospels like Thomas really tend to be more the voice of the people they call the Jesus people, which would have been, you know, the analogy there is kind of like the deadheads that actually, you know, sort of followed Jesus around. At least we think. Things that were written down within a generation and closer in geographic proximity to where he was. So, you know, that the language was probably more like something he would have actually said. But it's funny, in the middle of this great big long, you know, passage in John where Jesus is allegedly talking about how great he is, he comes out with this: no one has greater love than to give up one's life for one's friends. And bingo, you know, it was worth wading through all that stuff just to read that, because it's the truth. And when we think about all those people that laid down their lives, you know, having gone overseas, you know, and having had a battle buddy, I know what that feels like. I mean, I never actually, you know, was in a firefight, and I'm you know, I'm really very lucky. You know, I rolled the dice and came up with sevens. It wasn't that bad. But I know the kind of bonds that we form, and it's not just our bonds with our fellow soldiers, although those are extremely deep. You know, it's also the love that we have for our country and for, you know, those of you that we leave behind, and for, you know, some of the things that we want America to stand for, even if it doesn't feel like it stands for it today. And I found something I want to share with you. There are pieces of it that may be a little difficult to watch. It is from a movie that was shot entirely by an actual chaplain who basically did his deployment to Afghanistan with a camera. And it's called Love Under Fire. And I called it Love Under Fire. Actually, it's called No Greater Love.
Eddie, wait, Eddie!
The trailer with you.
Ready? Go down there, 3 Alpha! Alright, you're coming, you're coming!
My name is Justin Roberts. For 3 years, I was assigned as chaplain to the 2nd 327th Infantry Battalion, also known as No Slack. I wanted to recount the deployment to Afghanistan, so I decided to carry a camera.
Where's it coming from? Somewhere behind us that way. I don't know if it's on the ridge or if it's from the corner.
But it wasn't the photos and it wasn't the video that changed my life. It was understanding the stories behind them.
We were going into 2 known enemy strongholds. No one had ever dared go up there.
The Russians hadn't even been up there.
I hear this crack. And then I hear Sergeant Arena yell out,
RPG! Get him from there!
At the time, we didn't realize that we were headed to our biggest fight since Vietnam.
Hey, we need suppression on this ridge line! I've never heard so much gunfire in my entire life. And we have been in a lot of firefights, but that was by far the worst.
there was multiple positions firing on us.
I had to make peace with the fact that I was gonna die.
The casualties just started adding up.
We had 1 WIA and 1 KIA.
I brought him over here. I'll bring him back.
He's just looking straight up. He says, "Where's my chariot?"
And with his last dying breath, he apologizes for not being able to fight anymore.
I understood America so much more on the mountaintops of Afghanistan. What we stand for. People coming from all types of backgrounds, all types of races and religions, coming together as brothers and sisters. I witnessed that.
So, it takes a lot of love to do what all those who have fallen do, and it's difficult. And one of the, I guess the thing that I wanted to share with you, at least on this slide, is that not all the casualties happen in places like the one we just saw. Yeah, we lost some troops overseas, but we're losing them here in the U.S. every day, and I want to honor those people too. The people who came home walking wounded that just couldn't get any further. I think many of us have heard the number that we're losing 22 veterans a day, almost one every hour to suicide. And I couldn't find specific numbers on this, but this was an example from a group of veterans in Texas. And if you see the little kind of salmon-colored piece of the pie there, that's suicide, and overdoses is the sort of tan yellow color, which is not quite twice as many, but getting close to it. So it's very possible, if you extrapolate that out, that we're losing about 50 veterans a day. People who made it home, people that we would like to think survived the war, but didn't actually. And I want to remember all them as I'm saying prayers of gratitude and remembering to be thankful. And we're not done. Major combat operations have wound down in Afghanistan and Iraq. We may still be shooting into Syria. I don't have the intel feeds that I used to, but as of a couple of months ago, we still had almost 230,000 people deployed overseas, and I promise you some of those people are in harm's way. So as I think about why they died, what it was that they died for, when we go back to the very beginning, the Revolutionary War, the first thing, the primal cause, the reason that the first Americans laid down their lives for their country, it started out after the French and Indian War, and the British Parliament, which the American colonists had no say in, passed a series of acts designed to raise money to pay for that war that happened, here in what's now the United States. And those colonists, rather rightly, I think, were upset by that. Sure, they didn't like the taxes, but what really chapped their hides was the fact that they did not have any say. They got no vote at all. It was just rammed down their throat, and that didn't sit too well with a lot of them. And of course, we know the result. You can see on the little cartoon there, no Stamp Act. It was actually the Stamp Act that caused the Boston Tea Party. And they were talking about stamping the barrels of tea as having been the ones that had been taxed and were official and not smuggled, and those were the ones that the British government was trying to get the colonies to buy, because a lot of the members of Parliament actually had invested in that particular tea company. But that's anyway. The bottom line is that the original colonists wanted to have a voice in the government that made the decisions. That was the freedom that they were fighting for. And I think today, something that we need to remember as Americans is that freedom doesn't mean you get everything your way. You know, that freedom means that, you know, the franchise. I get a piece of the decision. I get to vote. You know, my voice gets heard, not my voice gets its way every time. And it's gotten to the point now where there are certain segments of our society that take offense anytime they are in a minority decision, anytime the, you know, popular opinion, which turns into the popular vote, does not go their way. And, you know, it's gotten to the level of things that are kind of silly, especially when we get down to talking about not wearing face masks during a pandemic. And it wasn't always this way. You know, I mean, I talked about this, I kind of previewed a little bit at the beginning of the service. You know, there was a time when citizens of the United States, the civilians, you know, were able to pull together and, you know, pitch in and bear a hardship. When I was searching on rations, which, you know, obviously controlling, you know, what you can and can't buy and saying you can only buy this much, you know, this many tires, this much gas, this much food, right? That is certainly somebody, you know, in the government telling you what you can and can't do. And we did it for years during the Second World War. And it was very specific. You know, I saw some of the things laid out there and it was like, okay, you can have this many pounds of meat per person and this many pounds of sugar per person. And, you know, it was no wonder people started victory gardens. They wanted to be able to make some of their own stuff. You know, stuff that wasn't part of the rationing, but people stepped up to the plate. They bought their war bonds. They used their ration coupons, and they came together in a common effort. And there was an amount of love in that as well. And, you know, it makes me wonder, and I mentioned this also, you know, in recent years, in the, you know, since 9/11, that price of freedom has been paid by an extremely small segment of society. There are very few of us that have experience in the military. I remember growing up, it was like almost all the men of my dad's generation had been in the military. In fact, we had okay, so I grew up in West Virginia, and my dad's side of the family goes pretty far back into the sticks. They were actually from down there on the West Virginia-Kentucky border where the Hatfields and the McCoys were, okay? So my great-grandma Susie she was just an old mountain woman. She had 9 kids, only spent one night in the hospital in her entire life. That was when she was 93, and it was the night before she died. But she had 3 boys, and among her 3 boys and all of her 6 daughters' husbands, and my dad, who was her oldest grandson, every last man in that family went to war except for one of her daughter's husbands, and none of the men of that family would speak to him for years after the war was over with. I mean, it was, you know, it was like we're all in this together, and if you're not, there's something wrong with you. But in the time since, you know, well, since Vietnam, but, you know, especially it seems since the first Gulf War, there's been a very small segment of the population that has actually done the fighting and the dying and the sacrificing. And it seems as, you know, although privilege has been with us for a long time, our sense of privilege, it just feels like it somehow that it has it's grown, or maybe it's just the fact that some of us are now aware of that privilege, and maybe it's always been that way.
I tend to think it's always been that way. I think it's always been that way. It's just we called it just the way things were, right?
Right.
Like a certain small group of people have always had more than everyone else.
Yeah.
It's
That's
just-
true. Although it goes again back to my point that like when everybody knows somebody, you tend to have a little more buy-in. It's like when there were more. It seemed like there were. Well, I mean, there still are a lot of people who are homophobic, but it seems like more people were homophobic until people who were gay started coming out of the closet, and they suddenly realized, oh, my Aunt Edna's gay. Oh, my hairdresser's gay. Oh, my my maid is gay, or then you start realizing, oh, I know somebody and they're nice and I like them, and that cognitive dissonance made them realize, well, wait a minute, we're kind of all in this. Anyway.
Charles, actually, some of my family history dovetails with this, even though I don't have, other than my mother's father, I don't have family that served in the military. My father was working very hard against conscription in the 60s and 70s for the American Friends Service Committee. Mm-hmm. And during the Vietnam War, he was going to high schools in New York City and talking to young men about whether they had a choice to go or not. That I think he won that war and lost the battle, metaphorically, or maybe I'm getting that backwards.
Won the battle and lost the war?
Yeah, because they did end, at least for that time, the automatic conscription. But then what happened, Dick Cheney, who'd been in administrations back then, was then in, vice president when we started warring more specifically in the Middle East. And the way that he, I think, intended to prevent demonstrations against it was by saying it was an all-volunteer army.
Yeah.
And at any rate, so I've watched that, and I've had a lot of conflict actually with what my father won and lost. I don't think ultimately that he did win.
Yeah.
And certainly, before we invaded Iraq, there were lots of protests, and after we actually went in, most of that stopped.
Yeah.
So anyway, just wanted to.
You just made me think about one thing, and that is, it's funny, back when there was still mandatory conscription, if you were rich enough, you could get out of it, as we well know, right? And even though we now have an all-volunteer army, for a lot of kids that put on the uniform, the armed services is the only chance for them to climb out of poverty.
And to get an education, absolutely.
To get an education, to get it, to learn a job that will not only pay them, give them health care, and then also pay for them to get an education. They're tossing the coin. It's like, am I going to survive this? And, it's one thing to do it in peacetime. But when the country's at war, some of those kids they're making a choice, and some of them didn't survive.
But I think your points are correct, that I don't think as a nation as a whole that we've really thought of ourselves as a nation at war.
No.
Because it only impacts the people who are relegated to just that that sliver of opportunity for the most part. Yeah. And that bothers me, that we are so easy to expend people without that consciousness for all of us.
Me too. I'm one of those people that I have 2 degrees in theater, and I have a degree, and I'm a minister, and yet up until a couple of years ago I was still in the military, and part of my feelings about it was I feel that those of us who can serve have a duty to serve, and I could. I could physically do it, and I was mentally suited to it, and I was good at it. So I did it. So before I show this next slide, I simply want to say that I in no way mean to demean anything that our soldiers who have died have done it for, and I'm not. I don't want to try to draw an equal sign between what it's like to die in combat and in some of the other places that we can die. But I felt like I kind of had to ask this question, so who's dying for us today? And yes, we do still have people overseas, and some of them aren't going to make it home. But right here, right now, we have, people who are, putting themselves in harm's way, and some of them aren't coming home, I have asterisks by a lot of the numbers on this slide because the statistics are not good. They're just kind of like the tip of the iceberg, and they're all out of date. But they were the most recent that I could find that were specific to essential workers. It is people who we call quote essential workers unquote, and I sometimes wonder if maybe to be honest, that word essential should be replaced with the word expendable. And the sad thing is that a lot of these people are people that are among those who could simply not afford to lose their job for a week, 2 weeks, 2 months. So many Americans, I thought I saw the statistic, it was 30 or 40%, I forget, millions and millions and millions of people could not financially survive a $400 catastrophe. And so many of those people who are, they're among the working poor, they're living hand to mouth, are in these jobs that we're now calling essential. And so then I asked myself, so what the rest of us, right? Us civilians, right? Us non-essential workers, how are we responding? And I was reminded of, how some people were treated, some service members were treated, particularly back during the Vietnam War. I know that there's recently been some people, attempting to, debunk this and say that, that stuff never happened. I'll tell you a quick story. I was in a 12-step meeting when I was living in Santa Barbara, and a guy told the story about when he came home from Vietnam, and they dumped him at the Greyhound bus station at like 2 a.m. in Santa Barbara, California, which is a sleepy little town to begin with. And of course, he's still in his Class A's that he had to travel in, and he still got his duffel bag on it, on his back. And he couldn't find a taxi. The town's dead. So he just puts his duffel bag on his back and starts walking. And he gets, half a mile down the road, and a police car pulls up to him. And the guy says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And he's like, I'm walking home. I just got home." And the guy says, "You got any identification?" And so, he shows the guy his orders and his ID and all this stuff. And he's like, "Hey, what did I do?" And the cop tells him, "Get in the back." And he's like, "Hey, what did I do wrong?" And the cop looks at him and says, "Son, you didn't do anything wrong. It's not safe for you." That's a guy that just came home from Vietnam. So today, how are we responding? Well, some of us are doing a pretty good job, and some of us are not doing so hot. This is a direct, I didn't make this up, a direct quote out of the news. Retail rage is happening all over the country. And this is just, a smattering of the examples that I could pull up there. And, we have all read stuff either on CNN or, whatever news source you follow, or, seen something in somebody's Facebook feed about, yet another, person who is, behaving badly towards an essential employee. And, I've got my poster Karen over here. Her name's actually Kristen, but she really looks like that person Karen that we talk about. People that are just really making life difficult on those folks who are going into harm's way for us. And it's not just the folks who are going into harm's way. It's, the folks who are making the decisions. But again, is it just privilege, or is it racial, or is our racism and privilege inherently linked? That's probably a different workshop for a different day. But certainly there are a lot of people out there, including these lovely lads, who are protesting in a way that would, probably get them at least run into the police station if their skin were a darker color, and doing it with impunity, and, really not worrying that, as it says here, that National Guard troops and tanks are going to come to their communities and stop them. I hope it doesn't come to that. But we've gone so far away from that community of shared love and sacrifice that this is what's happening today, for real. So I was trying to tie it back to, what do things look like, back in the day? And, privilege really isn't new. You guys have probably all heard the parable of the Good Samaritan. And a lot of people teach it in a way that highlights the generosity of the Samaritan. Here's this guy who's different from a person who's hurting, but he's going to be nice to him anyway, and he's going to take care of him anyway. But I don't think that that's the point that Jesus was trying to make when he told this, So he's being grilled by a Pharisee, right? By one of the officers of the Jewish temple. And he's asking him, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? What's written in the law? And they're going back and forth because this guy's basically kind of pop quizzing Jesus. And it says here in verse 29 in Luke 10, chapter 26, but wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he passed him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, money, gave him to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. It is really a comment about the people who passed by. Those were people who were, they were not only the temple authorities. By the time that Jesus was alive and was doing what he did, the Jewish temple authorities had become the proxy of the Roman government. All right? Now, Jewish temple law had grown from a long tradition of, how are we going to live together so that we can take care of each other, and essentially so that Judaism will not die, right? And it was patriarchal in the extreme, but it was the system that they'd come up with to take care of their people. However, by the time, and you know, it had started before, long before Jesus was alive, and you can read it in some of the prophets, particularly the later prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures, where, I mean, they get down on the people in Jerusalem for basically selling out, right? So by the time of Jesus, the temple was basically the rich and powerful people that Rome had put in charge to keep things quiet and to collect Rome's money. And those people, like a lot of people in those positions, are more concerned with their own personal wealth, safety, and power than they are with taking care of the people who they're charged with taking care of. But what Jesus was teaching us was self-sacrifice for the common good. He was teaching us about that greater love. In The Last Week, which is a book that I love to use to talk about Easter and Easter week and what that all means, John Dominic Cross and Marcus Borg talk in particular about Jesus's relationship with Jerusalem and his journey to Jerusalem. And they came to these four pieces here that follow, and this is especially shown throughout the Gospel of Mark, that following Jesus means following him on the way. And in fact, early Christianity was simply referred to as the way. Well, where do you go on the way? The way leads to Jerusalem. Why? Because Jerusalem is the place of confrontation with the authorities. What happens when you do that? It is a place of death and resurrection. And so central to to Jesus' teachings is that idea that we're going to die to the old and do that for the benefit of others, as well as to bring ourselves into a new way of being. Luke said that, I die daily, right? But when we go back to that greater love hath no man, it's not just laying down your physical life. It's leaving your old life behind. I like this picture I found. It sort of modernizes Jesus' conversation with the rich young man, where the guy says, okay, so what do I got to do to get into the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus tells him a couple of the commandments. And he's like, okay, I already do those. What else do I have to do? And Jesus kind of looks at this dude and figures him out. And he says, okay, what you need to do is you need to sell all your stuff and give the money to the poor and follow me. And the guy goes away unhappy because he's rich and he's got a lot of stuff, right? He didn't want to give it away. What Jesus is suggesting is that we have to die to that way of being, to really show that love that he's teaching that brings us into the kingdom of heaven. And there are times, he's sitting down at a meal with some of the holy guys, right? And he gets in their grill and he says, woe to you, right? Because you tithe all the right things, you say all the right stuff, but you neglect justice and the love of God. And woe to you lawyers. And when he's saying lawyers, he's not talking about our kind of lawyers. He's talking about the people that interpreted and enforced temple law. He says, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves don't lift a finger to ease them. So let's remember why, right? If no one has greater love than to give up one's life for one's friends, yeah, we can remember, the cause, whatever the cause is, whether it's freedom or getting through the war or getting through the pandemic. But let's remember the love that drives us and that, makes us who we are. And let's make sure that we're that love in action.